This chart shows the national debt to GDP ratio of major global economies, and towering over everyone else is Japan, sitting at an astronomical 248%. It makes them the most indebted country in the world. That debt is matched by a severe demographic crisis. There is such an extreme labor shortage that factories are facing shutdown, and 450 schools are closing every single year simply because there are no children left to fill the classrooms. But 40 years ago, this was the fastest-growing, most dynamic economy on the planet. They were practically printing money, building a standard of living that rivaled the United States. So we need to look at exactly how a powerhouse on the verge of global dominance engineered its own decades-long stagnation. By 1945, 67 Japanese cities were reduced to ash, millions were starving, and the industrial base you see here was entirely wiped out. Across the sea, the Soviet Union was backing Mao Zedong in China. The United States looked at a starving Japan and realized a hungry population would gladly accept bread from communist neighbors over promises of democracy. To prevent the Pacific from falling to Soviet influence, America actively rebuilt its former enemy. They pumped billions of dollars into Japanese factories, handed over blueprints for electronics and steel, and opened up U.S. markets to their exports. Within 2 decades, Japanese automotive and tech firms were dominating American competitors on their own turf. This explosive growth was a carefully engineered geopolitical shield. It turned a broken nation into a $5.5 trillion powerhouse that almost eclipsed the American economy. This is a line graph tracking the value of the US dollar against the Japanese yen in the 1980s. Feeling the pressure of Japanese dominance, America forced Japan to sign the Plaza Accord in 1985. This was an international agreement to devalue the dollar, and overnight, a single dollar went from being worth 260 yen down to just 130. Let's look at what that meant for exports. A Japanese car that cost $10,000 to buy in the US suddenly had to be sold for $20,000 just for the manufacturer to make the exact same profit. Their massive competitive pricing advantage vanished. To keep the export market alive, the Japanese central bank slashed interest rates from 5% down to 2.5%. The goal was to make borrowing cheap so companies could invest in better engineering and lower their production costs. But businesses didn't spend that cheap money on technology. They took out massive loans and pumped the cash directly into real estate and the stock market. The Nikkei 225, Japan's primary stock market index, shot up from 6,000 points to nearly 39,000 points. By 1989, the total value of all the land in Japan was estimated to be worth 4 times more than all the land in the United States. It was an illusion built entirely on cheap debt. Realizing the danger of this massive bubble, the Japanese government abruptly hiked interest rates up to 6%. The cheap money stopped, and the market violently collapsed. Corporations that had borrowed billions to buy overvalued property suddenly watched their assets lose up to 70% of their worth. They were left holding massive debts with absolutely no cash to pay them back. To stop a wave of bankruptcies, the government didn't let these businesses fail. They forced banks to give failing companies a second loan. But that new money was used exclusively to pay the interest on the first loan. Nothing went into product development. By the early 2000s, 30% of all Japanese firms were trapped in this loop. They became known as zombie companies, businesses that generated just enough cash to survive by slashing prices and freezing wages, but were completely incapable of growing. By refusing to let bad businesses die, the government drained the capital that could have funded new startups. They protected the old economy at the direct expense of the future. To keep the lights on and service their debt, these zombie firms stopped buying new machines, stopped innovating, and most importantly, completely stopped hiring new university graduates for an entire decade. Students who graduated during the 1990s couldn't get corporate jobs. They were forced to take part-time work in places like convenience stores. They missed out on learning management or high-level technical skills during their most crucial developmental years. Without stable employment or upward mobility, large segments of this generation delayed or entirely avoided marriage. By 2015, 1 in 4 men in Japan had never married by age 50, and national birth rates plummeted well below sustainable levels. The generation that was shut out of the workforce in the 90s are now in their 50s, and many are still relying on their elderly parents' pensions to survive. The financial safety net cast over corporations 30 years ago ended up smothering the population. Japan's decades of stagnation serve as a direct case study for rapidly growing economies today, especially emerging markets like India. When markets shift, poorly managed or over-leveraged companies have to be allowed to collapse. A functional economy absolutely requires robust bankruptcy laws to clear out the dead weight. Failing businesses release their grip on office space, factory equipment, and human labor. That friction is exactly what frees up the resources and capital necessary for high-growth startups to step in and build something better. Trying to freeze an economy in place to avoid the short-term pain of layoffs and bankruptcies doesn't save the system. It starves the soil, blocking out the sun for anything new trying to grow.